The great hall at Thornley smelled of beeswax and cold stone the morning Catherine Vane crossed its threshold as a married woman, and the first face she found in the long line of assembled servants was one she had buried 4 years ago in her own heart. The new Countess of Thornley had been schooled all week in the names and ranks of the household she now governed, and she walked the line with her gloved hand resting on the arm of a husband she had known for 11 days, nodding to the butler, to the housekeeper, to the footman, ranged like dark candles along the paneled wall. Then she came to the still-room maid at the end of the row, a thin woman in a gray dress with her hands folded and her eyes lowered, and the whole rehearsed mourning fell out of Catherine's body at once. She knew the set of those shoulders. She knew the small white scar at the left wrist, where a kettle had once tipped in a kitchen 100 miles south of here. The maid did not look up, and Catherine did not speak, and somewhere above them a clock counted the seconds with terrible patience. She had been told the woman's name was Hartley. She had been told nothing else because no one at Thornley knew that the new countess and the silent still-room maid had once shared a narrow bed under a leaking roof and had called each other sister, and had been parted by a thing neither of them had chosen. Stay with me through this one, because what the world had written off as a kitchen drudge with no past was about to undo a great house from the inside, and the woman beside her did not yet know it. What Catherine did not yet know was how her sister had come to be standing in that line at all. The marriage had been arranged in the practical way. Such things were arranged: a settlement of debts on one side and a settlement of name on the other. Edmund Carlisle, the Earl of Thornley, had needed a wife of unimpeachable conduct to quiet a county that had begun to whisper about his solitude, and Catherine, the well-bred daughter of a clergyman with more learning than fortune, had needed a roof that would not be sold out from under her dying aunt. They had met at her aunt's bedside, of all the unromantic places, and he had stood very straight in his dark coat and asked her 3 questions about her household economy and 1 about her opinion of cruelty, and she had answered all 4 honestly, and that had apparently been enough. He was not a warm man. The county agreed on that. He spoke in short, level sentences that left no room around them, and he looked at the world as though he had already decided it would disappoint him. Catherine had married him with her eyes open. She expected an arrangement, a careful courtesy, separate wings of a cold house, and she had told herself she could build a life inside those terms, the way one builds a fire in a grate too large for it. What she had not expected was Hannah. Her sister had been 12, and Catherine 15, the last time they stood in the same room. Their father had died in debt, the living gone with him, and the 2 girls had been split between relations the way a dead man's furniture is split. Catherine to the clergyman uncle who gave her books and a name. Hannah to a distant cousin in the north who promised to keep her, and then within a year stopped answering letters at all. Catherine had written for 3 years into a silence that swallowed every page. She had walked to the receiving office in 2 towns to ask whether her letters had been refused or lost, and the clerks had shrugged, and the cousin's house had been let to strangers, and a girl of 15 with no money and no standing had learned that the world does not return what it takes from such girls. She had grieved Hannah, as one grieves the drowned. And now the drowned was standing in her own great hall with a still-room key at her waist. And Catherine had to keep walking, because 40 servants and 1 watchful husband were waiting to see what kind of mistress had come to Thornley. She made it to the end of the line. She said the correct words to the housekeeper, Mrs. Dale, a square, competent woman, with a ring of keys and a face that gave away nothing, and she let Edmund lead her up the great staircase to the rooms that were now hers. And the whole way up she felt her own pulse in her throat like a second clock, and she did not look back at the gray figure below because she understood already, in the wordless way the body understands before the mind permits it, that one careless glance could be the thing that destroyed them both. The first dismissive verdict came that very evening, and it did not come from a stranger. It came from the dowager. Lady Augusta Carlisle, Edmund's grandmother, had ruled Thornley for 40 years through 3 earls and 1 regency of her own, and she received the new countess in the green drawing-room with the particular stillness of a woman appraising livestock. She was small and upright and dressed in gray silk that cost more than the still-room maid would earn in a decade, and her rings caught the firelight as she lifted her teacup. She looked at Catherine for a long moment over the rim of it. Then she set the cup down and said to her companion rather than to Catherine that the girl would do well enough, she supposed, for a clergyman's daughter, though one could hardly expect her to know how a house of this consequence was run. A parson's child, she said, raised on sermons and thrift. One must make allowances. Catherine heard it and kept her face smooth because she had been hearing some version of that sentence her whole life and had long ago learned to fold it small and put it away. Even so, she felt the heat climb her neck under the high collar of her gown, and she was aware with sudden unbearable clarity of exactly where the door to the servants' passage stood and of who might be standing behind it. She answered the dowager with a quiet remark about admiring a house, with long memory, and Lady Augusta's eyes sharpened a fraction, the way a cat's do when the mouse moves more cleverly than expected. Edmund had watched the whole exchange from his place by the window. He said nothing in the moment. When his grandmother had been handed into her chair for the night and the room had emptied, he crossed to where Catherine stood and looked down at her with that unreadable, smoke-colored gaze, and he said only in his level way that she should not let the old woman keep her from her supper. Eat something. You have gone pale. It was not tenderness. It could not possibly be tenderness, Catherine told herself, from a man who had asked her 4 questions and bought her conduct with a settlement. It was the courtesy a careful host extends to a useful guest. She thanked him and went up. And she did not yet understand that he had noticed her pallor at all, or that noticing was a thing he did not do lightly. She could not sleep. The house was vast and unfamiliar and full of the small sounds old houses make, and beneath all of it lay the one fact that would not let her rest. Hannah was here. Hannah was alive and thin and silent, and wearing the gray dress of the lowest indoor servant in a house Catherine now nominally ruled. The wrongness of it sat on her chest like a stone. She had spent 4 years believing her sister dead, and the last of those years learning to live with the believing, and now the grief reversed itself in a single morning and became something worse. Because grief, at least, is finished. And this was not finished. This was a living wound walking the back corridors with a tray in her hands. Before the household woke, while the sky over the park was still the color of pewter, Catherine wrapped herself in a shawl and went down the servants' stair. She told herself she only wanted to see the kitchens, to learn her own house. She was lying, and she knew she was lying, and she went anyway. She found the still room by its smell, dried herbs and vinegar, and the clean sharpness of preserving sugar, and she found Hannah at the long deal table with her sleeves pushed up and her hands deep in a bowl of red currants, and the years simply fell away. Her sister looked up. For one instant the careful blankness cracked, and Catherine saw the child she had lost, looking out of a grown woman's tired face, and neither of them could breathe. Then Hannah's eyes went past her shoulder to the door, the old reflex of a person who has learned that being seen is dangerous. And she said low and fast that the Countess should not be below stairs, that someone would come, that it was not safe. Not Catherine, not her name. The Countess. And in that single chosen word, Catherine understood how completely her sister had buried herself, and why, and at what cost. They had perhaps 4 minutes. Hannah told it in fragments, her hands never stopping their work because stopping would be noticed. The red currents bleeding through her fingers, the small, ordinary motion a shield against the enormity of what she was saying. The cousin in the north had used her hard, and then when the money ran short, had put her into service without a character, which meant she could be turned off at any whim and starve. She had gone from house to house that way, each one colder than the last, sleeping in attics where the water froze in the basin, learning to make herself so small and so useful that no one would think to be cruel to her for sport. A hiring fare 2 winters past had brought her to Thornley as a scullery girl. She had risen to the still room because she was clever with preserves and asked for nothing, and asking for nothing she had found was the surest way to be left alone. She had recognized the name Vane in the servants' hall gossip about the Earl's bride, had not let herself believe it, had told herself it was a common enough name, and that hope of that kind was a luxury she could not afford. Then she had stood in that line yesterday praying she was wrong, because if the new countess were truly her sister, then her sister had married into the one house where Hannah's secret could ruin them both. A great lady did not have a sister in service. It was not done. It would be a scandal that the county would chew for a generation, and the dowager, Hannah whispered, the dowager would feast on it. Catherine reached across the table and took her sister's wet, cold, reddened hand and held it, and did not care who came. She said they would find a way. Hannah said there was no way. Only silence, and that silence had kept her fed for 4 years, and Catherine must not break it now out of love. Then a board creaked in the passage, and Hannah drew her hand back and bent again to the currents, and Catherine straightened her shawl and became the Countess once more and Mrs. Dale came through the door with a candle and found her new mistress admiring the morning's preserves with admirable composure. What neither sister saw was the figure on the half-landing above the kitchen stair, where a man unable to sleep had come down for no reason he could have named, and had stopped at the sound of 2 women's voices, and had stayed. Edmund did not eavesdrop as a habit. He had heard enough, though. He had heard a countess call a still-room maid her sister, and he had heard the maid refuse the word for both their sakes, and he had gone back up the dark stair with something rearranging itself silently behind his still face. He said nothing at breakfast. He watched his wife pour his coffee with a steadiness he now knew was costing her everything, and he found that he could not look away from her hands. The days that followed taught Catherine the shape of her cage. She could not single Hannah out without inviting the very ruin her sister feared. She could not raise her, could not free her, could not so much as linger in the still room without Mrs. Dale's keys appearing at the door. The house watched its new mistress the way a court watches a foreign queen, and the dowager watched hardest of all. Catherine learned to send her glances sideways, to leave a particular book in the still-room window where Hannah would find it, to add a line to the weekly orders that meant a warmer blanket would reach a certain attic room without anyone knowing whose comfort it served. Small things, costly things, measured in the constant vigilance they demanded. And all the while she carried the weight of a love she was forbidden to name, and the house called her cold and proud, a parson's daughter putting on airs, and she let them, because the alternative was worse. Edmund began to come into rooms where she was. This was new, and the household noticed it before Catherine did. He had spent the years of his solitude moving through Thornley on fixed solitary lines, the study, the stables, the long gallery at dusk, and now those lines bent. He appeared in the morning room when she did her accounts, and stood at the window with a book he did not read. She would feel the change in the room before she heard him, a particular weight to the air, and she had learned, without permitting herself to learn it, to know the exact moment he had entered by the way her own pen faltered on the page. He never announced himself. He stood with his shoulder to the cold glass, and the unread book open against his palm, and the quiet between them was not the awkward quiet of strangers, but something stranger and warmer, a quiet that did not ask to be filled. Once she looked up and found him already watching her. The small frown she wore over her figures, and he did not look away as a stranger would have, and neither did she, and the moment held a beat too long before she bent again to her column of pounds and shillings, with her heart going like a hammer. She could not still. He rode out beside her carriage when she made her calls. He asked her once abruptly whether she had family living, and she said she had an aunt lately buried and no one else, and she watched his jaw tighten at the lie, and did not understand why a lie of hers should cost him anything at all. He did not correct her. He simply looked at her a moment longer than the question required, and then he said that a person without family must learn to make one, and walked away, and left her standing with her pen gone still in her hand. The witnessing came on a wet afternoon in the second week. A kitchen boy of perhaps 10, a thin child named Tom, who carried coals and was beaten for dropping them, had let a scuttle slip on the back stairs and bruised his hand and scattered coal across the clean flags, and the under-butler had raised his arm to strike the boy in the way such boys were struck. Catherine was passing the head of the stair, so unseen on the half-landing was Edmund, and it was not Catherine who reached the boy first. It was Hannah, out of the still room at a run, putting her own gray-sleeved arm between the child and the blow, and taking the under-butler's raised hand in both of hers and saying in a voice Catherine had never heard her use, that he would not. That the boy was hers to manage in the still room, and she would answer for the coal and for the flags and for anything else, but he would not strike a child in front of her. The under-butler, a head taller, stared at this thin woman who had no standing at all, and found somehow that he lowered his arm. There was a long moment in which the whole back stare seemed to wait on him, the cold dark across the flags, the boy pressed small against the wall. Hannah's two reddened hands closed firm around the man's wrist, and her chin lifted at him without a trace of fear. She did not plead. She did not raise her voice to match his. She simply held, and looked at him, and let the wrongness of what he had been about to do stand naked in the air between them until he could not bear it. Hannah knelt and gathered the boy and the coal both, brushing the black dust from the child's sleeve with a tenderness that undid something in the watching, and sent the child up with a quiet word, and began herself to sweep the spilled flags, and she did not know. She had been seen. Edmund had seen. Catherine had seen him see, and in his still face, for the length of one breath, something moved that she would not let herself name because naming it would have been the most dangerous hope of all. That night he found her in the library. She had gone there for the quiet, and he came in with a candle and did not leave, and for a while they spoke of nothing, the estate, the rain, a book she had been reading. Then he set the candle down and was silent in a different way, and he told her a thing she had not asked to know. He told her he had been married before. The county knew it, half knew it, the way counties know things, but no one spoke of it, and he had never once spoken of it himself. Her name had been Eleanor. She had been gentle and unhappy and afraid of him, and he had not seen it in time, had been too occupied with the management of his consequence to notice that his quiet had become a kind of cold. She could not live inside, and she had taken a fever one winter and had not greatly minded dying, and that, he said, was the thing he could not forgive himself. Not her death, but her relief at it. He carried her miniature still. He took it from his breast pocket as he spoke, a small oval of a fair, sad-eyed woman, and he held it in his open palm a moment in the candlelight, and then he closed his hand and put it away. He had decided, he said, never again to be the cause of a woman learning to want her own escape. That was why he had asked Catherine about cruelty at her aunt's bedside. It had not been an idle question. It had been the only question that mattered. Catherine sat very still and understood that the cold man the county feared was not cold at all, but ruined, hollowed by a grief he had earned and would not set down. And she understood, too, that he was telling her this because he had been below stairs in the dark and had heard a maid called Sister, and had watched that same maid shield a child, and was trying in the only clumsy language he possessed to tell his wife that he was not the man she had married, for safety, that he had begun to feel something that frightened them both. She did not say any of what she saw. She said only quietly that no one should be made to want their own escape, and she let her hand rest on the table near his, not touching, near, and he looked at the small space between their hands for a long time, and did not close it, and the not closing was louder than any touch could have been. The dowager moved against her in the third week, and she moved cleverly, because Lady Augusta did nothing without a reason. And she had begun to find the new countess insufficiently grateful, and the Earl insufficiently distant from his wife. She arranged a dinner. 30 covers the best of the county, candles the length of the long table, and seated near the foot of it, brought up from the neighboring estate where she was visiting, a young woman named Lady Sophia Fenn, niece to a marquess, 18, and golden and trained from birth for exactly this room. The dowager seated Lady Sophia beside Edmund. She seated Catherine far down the table among the lesser guests, a placement the whole county would read in an instant, and she let the meaning sit there in the candlelight for everyone to taste. The parson's daughter in her plain place, the proper match, restored to her proper seat, and midway through the second course, when the talk had turned to the management of great households, the dowager said, smiling, that of course one could not expect a girl of no family to understand these things, that breeding told in the end that a woman who had risen above her station always showed the strain of it eventually. She set it down the length of the table pleasantly. And the county heard it, and a small laugh ran along the candles like a draught. Catherine kept her eyes on her plate. A footman was at that moment carrying a dish past the foot of the table, and the footman was not a footman. The still-room had been short-handed, and Hannah had been sent up in a borrowed black gown to help carry, and Hannah heard every word of it, heard her sister called a woman of no family by a powdered old woman in diamonds, and her hands shook so badly that the dish chimed against its cover. No one noticed but Catherine. Their eyes met for half a second, the length of the bright, cruel table, and Catherine gave the smallest shake of her head. "Do not." And Hannah set the dish down and withdrew, and the dinner went on over the buried thing the way water goes on over a stone. Edmund noticed the dish chime. Edmund noticed everything now where his wife was concerned. He said nothing at the table. He did not laugh, though, and his not laughing was marked, and the dowager noted it and tucked it away. If this story has reached you, leave a quiet word below before the end, because the moment Thornley turned is nearly here. Now, back to the long table and the candles burning down. The dark moment came the following morning, and it came as such things come, dressed, as concern for the family name, Mrs. Dale had found the book in the still-room window, and a maid had gossiped about blankets sent to an attic room, and somewhere a footman had said he had seen the Countess below stairs at dawn in her shawl, and the pieces had reached the dowager, who assembled them with the patience of a woman who had been assembling such pieces for 40 years. She did not go to Catherine, she went to Edmund, in his study, and she laid before him a different shape made of the same facts. The Countess, she said, was conducting some intrigue below stairs. There was a still-room maid she favored unaccountably, met in secret at dawn, sent small comforts, a parson's daughter after all, with who knew what connections in the lower world she had come from. It would not do. It touched the name. The maid must be turned off without a character that very day quietly, before the county scented it, and the Countess must be brought to understand the bounds of her position. She had taken the liberty, she said, of instructing Mrs. Clay Dale to have the Hartley woman's box packed. Catherine learned of it from a white-faced kitchen girl who came to her at noon. She went down the stairs at a pace that was nearly running, and found Hannah in the still-room, with her small box already corded and her gray shawl already on, standing in the wreck of the only safety she had built in 4 years, and the under-butler waiting by the door to see her off the premises within the hour, turned off without a character, which, in the language of that world, meant turned out to starve. Hannah looked at her sister and did not weep. She had used her tears up years ago. She said only that it was as she had always known it would be, that love had broken the silence after all, and that Catherine must let her go now and say nothing and save the one of them who could still be saved. She picked up the box. She said the thing the dowager had said, gave it back to the room in her own flat voice, that she was a woman of no family, that this had always been true, that a person of no family had no claim on anyone and never had, and she turned for the door. And Catherine, who had folded so many cruelties small and put them away her whole life, found that she could not fold this one. She put herself between her sister and the door. She said, "No." Not quietly. And she said that Hannah would not go, that she would not stand in this house and watch her sister walked into the cold a second time, to keep a great family comfortable, that she would tell the whole county the truth herself, before she would let silence eat 1 more year of her sister's life. She was shaking. Her voice was not the Countess's voice. It was the voice of a girl of 15, who had walked to 2 receiving offices and been shrugged at, and it filled the low stone room. The study door, which Catherine had left open in her flight, gave onto the back stair, and the back stair carried sound, and Edmund Carlyle had followed his wife down it and was standing in the passage, and had heard all of it. He had heard her refuse to fold. He had heard her offer to ruin herself, her name, her safety, the whole arranged shelter she had married him to secure, rather than send her sister into the dark. And he understood at last the full shape of what he had been watching for 2 weeks, the cost of every sideways glance, and every line added to an order. The entire architecture of a love conducted in silence to protect the people she loved. He stepped into the doorway of the still-room. Both women turned, and the cold Earl, the county pitied, looked at the two sisters in the gray morning light, and did the thing no one at Thornley expected of him. He did not do it there. In the kitchen, where it would have been a private mercy, easily undone. He did it that evening, in the green drawing-room, with the dowager in her chair and Lady Sophia ranged at her hand, and the same county guests, lingering from the dinner, gathered for tea, in the exact room where his grandmother had first called his wife a parson's child who must be allowed her failings. He had Catherine on his arm, and he had, walking quietly behind them in her gray dress, because he had forbidden anyone to pack her box. The still-room maid named Hartley, whose name he was about to inform the county, was not Hartley at all. The room assembled its surprise slowly. A countess did not enter a drawing-room with a still-room maid 2 steps behind her. The dowager's teacup paused in the air. Edmund did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. He waited until the room was entirely silent, until even the fire seemed to hold itself, and he said that he wished to present a member of his family who had been too long unacknowledged under his roof. He said that the woman beside his wife was Miss Hannah Vane, the Countess's own younger sister, lost to her through no fault of either, and found again, by the grace of God, in his own still-room, and that she would take her place in his household as a sister of the house from this hour. Then he looked at his grandmother, and across the held breath of 30 people he said the thing that ended the matter. "This is my wife's sister. She stays." 5 words and a name. He did not gloat. He did not look at Lady Sophia, who had gone the color of the candles. He did not enumerate the dowager's cruelties or strip her of her dignity before the county. He simply set the fact down in the middle of the room where it could not be moved. And the fact did the work. The dowager's hand, when it came down at last to set the teacup in its saucer, missed the saucer by a half-inch and chimed against the table, and she said in a voice that had lost for the first time in 40 years its perfect level, that she did not understand, that this was not possible, that a thing of this kind could not simply be announced. It had been announced. The senior man in the room, the man whose name the house bore, had announced it, and the county that had laughed along the candles 2 nights before now looked at the thin maid in gray and saw, suddenly, the same fine bones and the same clear eyes the Countess wore, and the laughter died in their throats and became something more like shame. It was Edmund's own steward, summoned and present at the edge of the room, who sealed it past undoing, confirming in his dry official way that the necessary settlement had already been drawn that afternoon, a sum placed in Miss Vane's name, her position in the family a matter now of record and not of whim, beyond the reach of any teacup in any drawing-room. The dowager looked at her grandson and saw that he had thought of everything, that the displacement was complete and procedural and kind, that she had not been destroyed but quietly and permanently moved aside, and she was too old and too clever not to know when a thing was finished. She inclined her head a fraction. It was the most she could do, and it was enough. Catherine had not spoken through any of it. She stood with her sister's hand finally openly, in her own, in the bright candlelit room where 2 nights before she had been seated among the lesser guests, and she felt the whole long silence of 4 years go out of her at last, like breath held too long. Hannah was weeping now quietly, the tears she had thought used up, and Catherine held her and did not let go, and the county, which had come for tea and gossip, found itself witness instead to something it had not known it was hungry for, the sight of a thing made right. Winter came early to Thornley that year, and the first snow fell on a morning in late November while the family was at breakfast. They had taken to breakfasting together, all of them, in the small east room that caught the morning light, because Edmund had discovered in himself a hunger for crowded rooms he had spent 10 years denying. Hannah sat among them now in a soft green gown no longer gray, her hands healed of the red currant stain, and the kettle no longer her master, and the kitchen boy Tom, whom she had taken under her particular protection, and Edmund had quietly made a page, carried in the coals without fear of any raised hand. She had been given the rooms above the south garden, the ones that caught the afternoon sun, and she had filled the window with the small clay pots of herbs she could not stop growing. because 4 years of the still room had taught her hands a habit of tending that even safety could not break. The dowager breakfasted in her own rooms these days by her own choice, and sent down, now and then, a stiff civil note that everyone understood to be the nearest she could come to peace. She had asked once through Mrs. Muntrin, Dale, whether Miss Vane took sugar in her tea, and the asking had been its own small surrender, and Hannah had sent back word that she did, and that she would be glad to take a cup with the dowager any morning she was wanted. The morning had not yet come. It would. Catherine stood at the tall window with her coffee going cold in her hand, and watched the snow come down over the park, over the gray stone and the bare autumn trees, over the whole great house that had been a cage in October, and was something else now. On the sill before her lay the small, oval miniature of a fair, sad-eyed woman, which Edmund had taken at last from his breast pocket and set in the light of the family rooms rather than carrying, it hidden against his heart, because a grief did not have to be a secret to be honored, and Eleanor, he had said, would have liked the house better full. Beside the miniature, where Hannah had set it that morning, without a word, lay a sprig of dry lavender from the still room, the first small thing she had ever made in this house when it was the only safety she had, kept all this while folded in a cloth. Edmund came and stood beside his wife at the window. He did not touch her, and then he did, his hand closing over hers around the cooling cup, and neither of them spoke, because the room behind them was full of the voices of people they loved, and that was the whole of what either of them had ever wanted and never thought to have. The snow went on falling. Somewhere behind them, Hannah laughed at something the boy had said. A real laugh, unafraid. And Catherine closed her eyes and let the sound settle into her like the last stone set into a wall that would now stand. She had crossed that threshold in October, a married stranger in a cold house. She crossed each one now as a woman who had refused, once, to let go of a hand, and had been seen for it, and had been kept. The sisters were home. Thank you for staying to the end of Catherine and Hannah's story. If it moved you, leave a word below and tell me the moment your own breath caught.